All right. Jeff Berney here with me today. Thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, when I was looking through your bio and information, I got your information from matchmaker.fm, which is a online thing that connects podcasters with people to be on podcasts. Pretty nice.
Yeah.
It has on there that you're writing and you do crime and mystery. And then when I looked in a little more, I don't know if you describe your own writing that way or whether you'd say it's more thriller or scary, disturbing. Maybe some people would say mystery horror. How would you classify your writing?
Yeah, I would say it's more thriller and suspense. There's a little bit of horror, but um, it's really I really try to have thriller kind of be the sweet spot.
Okay. Suspense. That's a good word too. Have you seen the movie Bone Tomahawk?
No, but I like the name.
It's I thought it was a Western with
Well, why
what's his
wouldn't you?
name? Yeah. The picture of it was good and it had Kurt Russell is the star of it. And I thought, oh, this is gonna be a good Western, maybe a little follow-up tombstone type thing.
Yeah.
And then after the opening scene, I was like, man, this is a scary Western. And then more into it, I was like, and I was watching it at night and I was alone. So that probably added to the effect. And there was a little bit of a storm outside. And then I looked at the description of it and it said Western horror. And horror is not really a thing I get into, but that seemed an appropriate classification for that. I would think of it more as a psychological thriller, but it had the elements of horror for sure. Like the
Yeah.
Saw movies. I've probably seen one or two Saw movies, maybe. It's not my normal thing I watch, but Bone Tomahawk, if you get a chance, check that out. It is best to watch alone and when it's stormy and dark outside. Don't watch it with your kids. It's not a kid appropriate. I don't care how old they are. Don't watch it with your kids.
Good
They're
to
40
know.
years old. You're 60. Don't watch it with your kids. All right. So, with your writing, how do you, when you're planning your book and thinking about it, do you kind of separate the elements of the crime and suspense or mystery or thriller part, or how do you do your planning for your books?
I am very much a planner, for sure. Um, and I don't necessarily think I consciously separate things. What I try to look at first is the characters, and I really do a insane deep dive into who my characters are, at least the main ones. Um, really trying to bring them to life in my own head, so that hopefully I can bring them to life on the pages. Because for me, there's nothing worse than reading a book and the characters just don't seem either real or they act a certain way on part of the book and then they conveniently act another way, to support the plot somewhere else. So I start with the characters, and then for me it's kind of a game of, okay, this is a psychopath, who is this kind of person. Not being a psychopath myself, you just have to trust me on that.
That's what a psychopath would say, but okay.
Of course. um, it's kind of fun. It's a little game for me. Like, what would I do? How would I get away with this if I was this person? Or, if this happened to me, how would I react? And so that's kind of where I start. And then, I do have kind of the story arc in my head as well. So, kind of marrying the characters with the story that I want to tell. And then so far it's mostly worked out.
Okay. The having that empathy works in life, but it also works when you're developing a character. You're putting yourself in those situations. That's got to be uncomfortable, maybe for people
Oh
when
yeah.
you read some of your things. That then they're like, "Oh, this guy's thought about this."
Yes, and my mom hasn't finished my second book because it is really weird. There's lots of weird characters in it, and they do crazy things. It's also it does play with me, and I think that's why it takes me a couple years between books, not because um, it takes me so long to write the book before it comes out, but I got to put it away for a little bit. I got to
Mm.
like just erase the darkness for a while. Um, and I wish that I could write like, oh, in between these dark thrillers that I love writing, I'm going to write this children's story or, something happy to kind of, as a palate cleanser. But I sit down to write and my brain doesn't work that way.
Yeah, that might be more of a mark of a psychopath, I
That's
think,
true.
is if you could switch back and forth.
Well, good. See, I'm safe.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good. It's good. The definition of psychopath and sociopath to me has changed over time because in intermediate school or elementary school or wherever I first heard about these things, maybe it was in high school, I don't know. But it seemed to me that a psychopath was a person that didn't have empathy but could fit into society. So they're playing this persona.
Right.
And then a sociopath is a person that doesn't have empathy and or has a hard time understanding empathy and can't fit in. And and it seems now that the definitions have changed a little more to where people call what I used to think psychopaths were sociopaths. But what's your view on that?
It's funny. My wife and I talk about this a lot. My wife is my first reader, my editor, my
Nice.
when I sit down to write a story, I kind of think about, the what would entertain her or
Mm.
what would drive her crazy, and she'd be like, "You can't publish this," because sometimes that's fun too. But so we talk about sociopaths a lot because my two books kind of they are there are people in there who are definite sociopaths, and if you research it, like there's a ton. Most CEOs, I guess I shouldn't say
Mm.
most. A lot of CEOs would be classified as sociopaths. So it's an interesting thing to think about and to retrain yourself on because it's like, okay, sociopaths aren't always killers, right? But they think differently
Right.
and act differently, and so getting your mind into that is interesting as well, and just the fact that yeah, there's probably more sociopaths out there that we don't like recognize or know about. And then when you go to the psychopath, I think those are probably like the sociopaths who act out on it. Like I'm
Mm.
different and I don't care about the people who aren't like me, and so I'll get rid of them.
Mm.
I think that's
Okay. It's good that you have someone there that can read it and that you're, I guess what I would call an ideal reader, the person that you see as your audience. And then you
yeah,
can put
yeah.
things in there like he always leaves the cabinet doors open. And, if she doesn't like that, she's going to pick up on it.
Yeah, and I try to put little Easter eggs in there for her, that are just things that a normal reader would breeze past as set dressing, and it's like,
Hmm.
oh yeah, that, that's something I do, or that came from the kids always do that, so
Yeah.
it's fun.
Layers. I like layers.
It's an extra challenge, as you're writing the story.
What's your current writing setup? Like, where do you write? What do you use to write? How do you get into the zone for writing?
It is tough for me because I work full time, but I think a lot of authors, unless you're Stephen King level or um, whoever the biggest romance author is these days, has that real job also. But I tend to work in my office in the basement. I use Scrivener as kind of my outlining and writing platform. And, I do, I use something called the snowflake method. And I wish I had Googled that right before this interview so I could tell you the uh, dude that created that um, idea. But he's an author. I think he's also an engineer, which is weird because I am not an engineer. I am in advertising. Started as a copywriter. I'm a creative director now, so definitely not that analytical mind in most things that I do. But I found his method to be really interesting. And so when I was first starting to write fiction and try to figure out how do I usually write 30-second, 60-second TV and radio spots. How do I go from that to 90,000 words? It just feels like overwhelming when you're starting. And so this snowflake method is really interesting because it takes the idea of, a snowflake kind of builds on itself from the smallest crystal to, and so you start with one sentence, like, and it's a sentence that describes what your story is going to be. Then you take that sentence and turn it into a paragraph. You take that paragraph, you turn it into a page. Take that page, you turn it into like a 3 to 5 page kind of treatment. And that is, and along the way, you're also kind of fleshing out your characters. And so that helped me, I think, especially in the beginning when it felt overwhelming, like I don't even know where to start. And I think, like a lot of writers, I read a bunch of, from other established writers, like, here's my method and here's what I do. And I started trying to be a pantser, just sitting down at the empty screen and I'm just going to start and write. And my mind just didn't work that way. I wander. I start to plan in my head anyway, and so it's like, all right, I'm gonna give in. I'm gonna see that I'm a planner, and this method has worked for me so far.
Yeah, I imagine that first engineering and advertising are similar because while if there was an engineer that was a spider, it's creating this web with perfect angles and perfect support and all that. But if your spider is an advertiser, they're trying to catch something. So they're going to want that coverage. And you're going to reach kind of the same thing from different ways. So your web might be a little different looking, but it's still there for the same reason. So I like the idea of the advertising switching over. That mind's got to work well for writing. And I think that's probably why you're into the planning a lot more too. When you're just regular life out there in the world thinking about writing and living life, do you also take notes during the day? Or
I do. I've got notes on my phone. I probably have notes with, like, sometimes it's just one word, sometimes it's a sentence, sometimes it's, more than that, of story ideas that I get. So I've probably got like hundreds of story ideas. Probably 99 of them out of 100 are awful. But the good thing about having that advertising background is, most of what we do as we're working on creating an ad or a campaign is we're brainstorming and we're building on other people's ideas. And so I'm used to, okay, here's a bad idea, but there's like a nugget there and I can take that and use it somewhere else. And so I do that a lot. I do have Scrivener on my phone. So there have been times when I'm, waiting in line to pick up my kids, or, I'm out running an errand that I'll pull over and like, oh man, this is really good. I got to write this down. Or even sometimes like just a description of a character, like, oh yeah, I want them to talk like this. And so I'll write those things down. And I do that a lot. And sometimes I used to just email myself before I started using notes. And then I realized, man, that's a lot of emails clogging up my inbox, and I don't know where to put them. And so I've got a bit more organized about it. But yeah, like just those little threads that just come to you when you're not expecting it. And I think that's part of the fun for me anyway of writing fiction is like, oh man, this would be a great thing to incorporate. And I've got the power to incorporate it the way that I want. So it's kind of an interesting, and that's honestly for me what makes it so fun to be an author is like you're in charge of the world, and what do I want the world to look like? Not necessarily what do I want it to look like, and what would I like the ideal of the world to be? It's like if the world was really bad,
Yeah.
what would happen?
Yeah. When you're taking those notes, I got a word for it called automaty. So if my wife is talking to me or something, or I start writing a note and she's like, "What are you doing?" It usually comes out as taking a quick note because you don't want to forget that idea. But what the word I try to use is automaty. Like I have a mighty good idea that I don't want to forget, so I need to write it down. But
And I can't
if
pause to tell you about
yeah,
it because then I'll forget it. Yeah.
yeah, if I explain that word to her, which I've explained a few times, but every time I say it, she's like, "What? What are you talking about?" And I was like, "Okay, taking a quick note." She
Yeah.
hasn't gotten on board with my new words, but yeah, I think that's the difference. A writer and not is the writer writes. So you're going to have those notes everywhere. And I would expect for advertising and marketing, you probably have as many notes for that stuff too, where you're just standing in line and you're like, "Oh, this would be a good way to, this would be a good commercial. This would be a good way to sell something."
Yeah, they're less morbid on my advertising notes, but yeah,
Mm,
they're there too. And speaking of your wife, my wife calls me out all the time when I'm in, she calls it my book brain. Like, you're here, but you're not really here. You're still in your story. And so I have to like be cognizant of that and try to be present when I'm not.
yeah. That could be particularly disturbing given the writing. Like,
Absolutely.
what are you thinking about right now? It's a car chase. He's got a hatchet.
If I poison someone, how would I get away with it? Yeah.
Can you pass the salt? Mm. Yeah, you got to write, and sometimes you have to take that moment to keep those notes. It stinks to have the idea, know it's a good idea, and then forget it before you write it down. And
And
I don't think,
I can't tell you how many times that's happened to me. Like,
yeah,
I'll be in a situation where I either don't have my phone with me or, we're driving and I can't pull over and take a note. And I'm like, okay, I'm just repeating it in my head as much as I can. And then eventually I forget it. I'm like, oh man, I've lost so many good ideas that way. But I like to think they're still back there and they come out when they're supposed to. So
yeah. Which leads to the question of where do you think those ideas come from? Is it something that you manifest, or where do you think they come from?
this in terms of like story ideas, my first book, A Killer Secret, super loosely, like when you see TV movies that say, based on a true story, and then like, all right, it's not like the true story is somebody got shot, and that's the only true part of it. Everything else was
Right.
embellished. Like that's kind of where A Killer Secret came from. I read this article, and I don't even know why I paid attention to the article. But there was a man who super lonely guy, didn't have friends, didn't have any surviving family, and he started going to therapy, and he felt like his life was boring, and he wanted to impress his therapist, and so he ended up telling her that he was a serial killer, and she believed him to the point where she thought that someone was in imminent danger, so she had to report it to the police. So this guy
Mm.
ended up going to jail for a while before they realized, oh, he just made everything up. And I just thought, oh man, I mean, first of all, it's a very sad story if you think about the human condition there, but it for some reason got me thinking about, okay, what if there was uh, a serial killer who confessed to his therapist, and that's the true part, right? But then the rest of it came somewhere from my brain of, ooh, this would be a fun ride to, go along on. And I guess fun for me, but not necessarily for other people.
Hmm.
So that's kind of where that one came from. Uh, my second book, The Fall of Faith, I honestly don't know where that one came from. It's based on the very small, crazy, backwards town that my wife grew up in. But and I think that's kind of where I started percolating on that one. Like, this was a very, like I said, kind of not even a dot on the map that people would know.
Is
And
that the Eden place in the
yeah,
book? Okay.
yeah. Um, and so the real town that she grew up in, super rural, very small, but like a huge, like, underbelly of like crime and drugs. And I thought,
Mm.
oh, that's kind of interesting. She would not describe it in interesting ways. But I was like, like, really, if you think about it, like, you don't necessarily think of small towns as being, well, at least I didn't, of being like, oh, there's gangs, there's human trafficking, there's drugs, manufacture and dealing. And I'm like, what a ideal place for a criminal to live and create an enterprise than this small town that nobody's ever heard of, right? And so that's
Mm.
kind of where that came from. And the Fall of Faith also has it does have underpinnings of kind of like religion, but I think maybe it was probably my internal um kind of battle of, what do I believe in? What do I want to believe in? And if all this craziness and murder and death is going on around you, what would you end up believing in? And so that was just kind of for me, an interesting thing to play with and try to think through. And at the end of the day, that's why I write. It's like, I want to explore these things. I explore them in a very dark way, but I still kind of, I meditate on them and think about them and try to figure things out.
Yeah, it's a good exercise when you're somewhere, maybe by yourself, but it's more fun if you have somebody you can talk to about it, where you just make up stories of the people that are going by. So
Yeah.
if you're sitting in the gas station at a small town, and then you could just talk all about everything, it ends up, you'll have characters bleeding in from Justified and other places. That person cultivates heroin, poppy over on the other side of the hill, and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But it's, yeah, people have seen that enough to where they believe it because they just see it in stories. But then you got to think, do they see it in stories because it's based on a true story? These actual events. There are drugs. There are people that make them. There are people that get killed. And then there's your series. Go with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So then, how long did it take between your first and second books?
They were about 2 years apart. I write really slow. We have a bunch of kids. I work full time, and I actually enjoy spending time with my wife. So writing is kind of in the corners or the shadows, when I've got a spare moment. And I think that's also why it helps me to be such a meticulous planner, because sometimes it might be a couple weeks before I come back to it, and I'm like, I gotta
Mhm.
know where was I and where am I going.
Yeah.
So it probably takes me about a year to write, and then I am still at the point where I try to put the story away for a couple months, maybe 3 months if I can, to try to forget as much about it as I possibly can, and then come at it from the editing point of view, and it feels more like, ooh, somebody else wrote this.
Yeah.
Sometimes I wish, when I'm looking through that first draft, somebody else wrote it, because
Hmm.
first drafts can be pretty bad. But And then, I do the first edit, and then have an editor do a pass or two, depending on how bad the first draft is, and then start the publishing process. And then after that, it just kind of depends on. I'd like to take a break so that I can be more present with my family, but also so that I can kind of reset my mind and not see the entire real world as dark as the one that I've been living in for a year or so.
Yeah.
And then inevitably I'll go back to my list of story ideas, or have had more since then, and one will pop out and say, hey, it's my turn. Um, and that's another fun thing, because I didn't set out to write A Killer Secret was my first book that I published, but it's not what I sat down to write when I started. There was another story, and I thought, it was a super interesting story, and there were some complications in it that I wasn't sure that I was ready to figure out as a writer. And so I put it aside, and that's actually the story that I'm working on now. So it's funny how they'll kind of reshuffle in my priority list and tell me, hey, no, you know what? You're not ready for that. You're going to write this one this time.
Yeah, I've heard other writers talk about it as in they weren't good enough to write that story at that moment.
Yeah, that's how I felt.
That makes sense. And then there's other times
right now. We'll have to see in a year or so.
Oh. The other times where the story just has to get out. It just bubbles up through it. And yeah, I like the way you explain the next story popping out, and that's the one you go with.
Yeah.
How much do you think your professional work in marketing, would you call it marketing? Yeah. Marketing. How does that affect your writing, do you think? Do you use that in there, or the same ideas?
I think, I think it, on a negative note, I probably use too many adjectives, because advertising, we like to use a lot of adjectives. So I've kind of have to retrain myself when I'm writing fiction. But it does help in that, I've been a writer for 25 years, just a different genre, right? Advertising. And so I do think that I've gotten good at, I think this is a good story, and I can trust myself that that's a good story that would make a good ad or book or whatever. And then just the fact that I do have that rote ability, it's kind of second nature now of, okay, when I sit down at the computer to write, I know something's going to come out, and it may not be good, but that's okay. I'm going to let it come out, and then I'll fix it later, which is, I think, a lot of new writers who don't, haven't written for their career. It feels really bad when you write a scene and you go back and you read it and you're like, oh man, this is awful. No one's going to want to read this. But knowing that first draft is not going to be great, but there's going to be nuggets in there that are good, and that you can, mine and polish up and make good. I think having that, and just the discipline of writing when you can. I think it also helped me writing as a professional in advertising, knowing that, the prevailing wisdom in novel writing is you have to write every day, right? Like, sit down, button seat, write.
Right.
And my life just doesn't work that way. There's just too much going on professionally and personally. But having that background of writing, and knowing that, I'm a writer, I know how to write. So if I have to pause, if it does take me longer than most people, that's okay. I've learned to trust myself and my process. And eventually a story will come out. Now, whether it'll be good or not, that's not my problem yet, right? That's my editing problem.
Yeah. You can see that approach there with the advertising in the snowflake idea.
Yeah.
Where you come up with that log line or that that quick summary of this is what it is, and now here we go. That seems like it is also the way you write your novels.
Yeah,
That's
definitely.
cool. When you're writing and you're thinking of your wife as far as what she's going to think when you're writing is the story going to track with her? Are you also in the back of your mind or anywhere thinking, how am I going to market this story, or what's the popular part of this? Or are you looking at it from, I'm just writing this story and then marketing comes later?
I think a little bit of both, because I use that snowflake method. I feel like that first sentence and that first paragraph that I'm creating, I like to think of it as, like you said, kind of the log line, the tagline to that book or story, and maybe that first paragraph is the information on the back of the book. It's not exact, once I'm finished, that's not exactly
Right.
what I use, but at least it's kind of that starting point, and it makes me think, okay, if I write this log line and this paragraph as if like I know what's going to happen, but as if I'm writing it for my wife or the eventual reader, I'm starting from a point of, okay, I can think of how I might market this later, but then I don't give it any more thought until after I'm finished. um, I just think that would like cross the wires for me personally. Like I'd be too much into, especially the things that I write, which are super dark sometimes. I had one reviewer that said that they had to take a shower after they read one of my books because it was so dark and just like crazy in a bad way. Um, I, I
Struck
think
a
that if I
nerve.
was worried about marketing it, I might pull that back, even subconsciously and not go there. Um, but honestly, that's what I like
Oh,
about writing
you
fiction.
embrace that.
Yeah, I don't have to edit those thoughts that come out, right? Because they're not, I mean, they come from me, but the it's from a character, right? And I know this character is not me. This character is some super dark, bad dude, right? And how would he see life? It wouldn't be all roses and everything's fine. It would be, who am I killing next, or who's going to try to kill me next, or everybody's a mark, so
Yeah.
I, I think what keeps me sane is knowing that, all right, those thoughts that came out came from me, but they're because I was exploring this other person, and maybe I'm just fooling myself, but that's okay.
Yeah, that'd be I guess it'd be more of a comedy type skit where you have the parent is meeting whoever is dating their kid, and the kid is a writer of disturbing things, and they're like, "Oh, I recognize your name. Did you write this book?" And it's a disturbing book, and they say, "Yeah, I did that." And then you start looking at them differently, and you're like, "Oh," but that's the character. That's the character that did that. That's not me. That's the character. And then you're like, is that your car out there? It's the same type of car that's in this book they wrote about how they take people out and kill them somewhere at old drive-through movies. Where y'all going tonight? Well, there's this new drive-through that's open, and you know
Yeah,
that's
and honestly, I think that's why my mom didn't finish my second book, and I'm like, okay, cool, don't make yourself finish it because I don't want you to look at me differently.
then you can just say things every now and then, like she passes you the stuffing at Thanksgiving, and you just look at her and say, "You got to leave the spoon like that." But maybe you don't want to disturb your mom, maybe,
No, no,
or you just go with, "Mom, you made me."
right, right. This one is dedicated to you.
Do you think this is nature or nurture? What's happening here on these
Uh,
pages? How do you then, when you finish your book and you start doing the publishing part, what's your experience with that? Self-publishing, publishing at a house? How do you market it? Do you use your profession to help with that?
yeah, I am self-published. I set out wanting to be self-published. Um, I guess, I have kind of this independent entrepreneurial streak. I started my own ad agency for a few years. And so I thought, I want to own my work. I want this to be my work. And I also, I read a bunch about, and again, depending on what you read, you can get in a vacuum of noise of everybody agrees because you're just in this certain media area. But
Mhm.
the more I read is, if most authors, even trad authors, um, they're not making a lot of money from their novels. They're not getting a whole bunch of support from their publishing houses. Um, and I thought, okay, well, I'm unknown. I don't know if I'm any good. I'm gonna I'm gonna try this, and I'm gonna start it as if it's a business, right? I don't, I didn't set out with, okay, I'm gonna be a publishing house, and here's my logo and all that stuff. But it was like, I'm gonna treat this as a business, and so I've got a business plan. I've got marketing plans, and all those kind of change, as you go and as you learn. But that's what I wanted to try, and so publishing the first book, it was a learning curve. It was okay. I want to be on these, 4 or 5 major platforms because again, another thing that I was really adamant about is I wanted to be a wide. I didn't want to be beholden to Amazon. Although I'll just be completely honest with you and your audience, 99.9% of my sales come from Amazon.
Yeah.
And I think that's a function of, that's where, when you think of books, most people think, okay, I'm going to at least start with Amazon, and then you get sucked in. And but I want to be wide because I think I'm thinking of it as a long-term plan, hopefully a long career, and starting very slow. And so publishing the first book, I did a lot of social media for marketing, and realized that I wasn't selling a lot of books on social. That it takes a while to build the audience on social, and you don't want to just push your book, down people's throats for every post. You need to start conversations and be part of conversations. And oh yeah, I've got this book. And for me, I just kept getting sucked into the social media machine, and I realized, oh, that's a time suck, and I
Yeah.
could be writing or spending time with my family. And at first it's like, no, I'm promoting my book, and then I'm like, no, I'm just interacting with people and hoping that eventually they'll buy. So I haven't really cracked the marketing part of it, which feels shameful because I'm in
Mm.
marketing, but
Yeah.
it's become such a pay for play kind of thing. You're on Amazon, but no one's going to see you because you're ranked, 1.8 million out of 20 million books. You got to pay for
That's
some
pretty
ads.
good. Hey, you're in the top.
I know, it's like you got to step back and look at it. It's like, oh yeah. So, I've always taken that mindset of, the best marketing for your book is that next book, right? So I keep trying to trudge forward with creating more content. I did just finally get audio versions of both the books. Again, I tried to do for years. I tried to figure out how do I do this as independently as possible and not go through Amazon or Audible, but they make it so inexpensive, especially if you're doing a profit split. If you can get a narrator to do a profit split, and I couldn't financially figure out, okay, how do I do this myself? So I ended up doing Audible, but I thought, okay, now I've got audiobooks as opposed to not having them. So it's one of those things where you have to weigh the pros and cons of everything you do.
Yeah, you're building that catalog up to where when and if somebody sees it and you have that element of luck that it takes to get picked up by the logarithm algorithm, or whatever happens in the internet machine and people start buying it, that they can then go back and go, oh, there's some other ones. Oh, look at this. This is great. I like this one.
Yeah.
I'm into the disturbing thrillers. So I'm
Yeah.
digging
And
this.
I've spent a lot of time, most of my marketing time, I would say, has been to try to get reviews. I mean, I had heard how hard it was to get reviews, and I mean, hearing something is definitely different than experiencing it. But
Yeah.
if I'm honest, I never used to really review books before I started writing them. Like, I might
Hmm.
sometimes, give them 4 or 5 stars or 3 stars, whatever. I might rate them, but not review them. But even then, I wouldn't always do it. Um, and now knowing the importance of that, not just for that algorithm, like, you need to have 50 reviews before Amazon starts pushing your stuff on other people, but for just for that um, person who's never heard of you coming to see, oh, well, there's no reviews, or there's one review and it's a did not finish, so you need those reviews as kind of like social proof of like, oh, I've never heard of this guy, but he's got 4.6 stars out of 50 reviews. So he might be legit, and then they might click on it. So that's what I've been trying to build, and that's much harder than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, you often end up just in a figurative room of people that are also there looking for an audience. So it's like going to an art gallery with all the artists and nobody there to buy it. And it's kind of like going to a book club too, or like a writer's group. And sometimes there's definitely going to be strange people there, but sometimes you meet people that'll actually read it and do those reviews because they understand. But a lot of the time, my experience is you're just meeting people that are into what they're doing themselves. They don't want to talk about it, and they don't care what you have to say about it. And you're like, oh, they just want you to listen to their thing they just wrote that morning. And you're like, well, let's do 500 words instead of 5,000, and maybe put some thought into it. I'm game at like the 5th draft. Maybe give me the 5th draft version of this, not the version you did with Dragon and you didn't put any punctuation or capital letters in. Just come on.
That's avant-garde, right? That's like cutting edge.
Yeah. Yeah. It's avant-garde. But I see what you're saying about the social media. That's my least favorite part of the writing, or marketing the writing, if there is any marketing, or even with the podcast, is having to put those things on Instagram and X, because you get caught in that, then you start looking, you're just scrolling at things. And then if you get into the dark corners of X, then you get lost in that stuff, and you spend most of your time going, I can't believe that's going on, or show me less of this, show me less of this. And I'd just like to see some dog pics, maybe some
God, show me less of this.
yeah, some soldiers coming home and they're seeing their dogs for the first time in 6 months. Let's see a couple of those videos. But also on those, I do like when I connect with other writers or other creative people, and then I get to see what they're doing. That's the exciting part of the social media, because then you can say, oh, that's, if you know a photographer and they put a picture up there and you're like, hey, that's a good picture. So you can comment on it, or at least like it, or whatever. So they know they're not just yelling into an empty room.
Yeah. And
that's the exciting part of the social media.
And that's what I got from social media. It's kind of that you're not alone kind of thing. And most of the people that I interacted with were other authors, to your point, who were trying to push their works, not necessarily wanting or having the ability to, buy other people's. So, I mean, that camaraderie was cool, but it was just costing me time that I thought, well, I only have a finite amount of time. I have more stories to write, and these don't, doesn't seem to be helping me sell those stories. So I'm just going to pause that for a while and see if it makes any effect. And honestly, hasn't had any effect on my sales. So right now I'm like, I think if I was a known entity, then people would be interested in what I have to say on social, whether they should or not. I mean, we can talk about
Yeah,
that,
maybe. Yeah.
but nobody knows me, so it's like nobody noticed that I'm not on social media anymore. Nobody cares, and so I'm like, all right, cool. I don't have to worry about that. I'm just going to keep writing.
I noticed you haven't posted any pics on Pinterest lately. So
I haven't. You're right.
I know.
That's the one I kept because when I first started writing, I thought, what is the most innocuous, seriously, like social media channel that I could use that won't suck me in? I'm like, I don't spend time on Pinterest. Um, and I thought, oh, cool. And that's how it started. I'm gonna um, show some pictures of Kansas City, which is where the first book is set, and
Yeah.
there's a haunted house I mentioned in the book, so I'm going to put that up there. Or there's an
Is
old
that brick
house,
building?
yeah. Or there's an
Yeah,
old
yeah.
house that they live in, so that's a real house, uh, historic building, and so I'm going to put that up there. And that was kind of fun. Uh, and then it was like, oh, now it's work. So,
Hmm. Yeah.
what I'm saying is, I need a social media team.
I'd never thought that, looking at it, I'd say, no, I like to do that stuff. I like to learn how to do it. I wouldn't want to hire that out. But there are a lot of things that I would probably hire out, or at least have a team that you could say, you're working on this. Let me know how it goes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and
See the
same.
advantage of
It's
that.
like, oh, somebody else can't do my social media. This is me. This is my voice. And then it's like,
Yeah.
I would gladly have someone else do it, so I don't ever have to think about it.
What are your thoughts on the show Mad Men being in the business?
I loved it. It's where I discovered John Hamm, who now is like one of my favorite actors. I don't know if you're watching the latest season of Fargo, but dude is
I'm
amazing.
not. Oh,
Uh,
okay.
but in terms of like when that came out, I was working at a super huge agency at the time, and thinking of, and I'm a student of history. And so I knew that the 60s were definitely kind of the era for the madman, right? The advertiser who um was just a louse and drunk all the time, and chasing women. But you don't ever think about it as, it almost becomes like fiction in your head, right? That never happened. And I know Mad Men is fiction too, but it's like, that's they talked to
What he did that Coke commercial.
they talked to advertising guys who were around then, and they got some of this. And just seeing, for me, the biggest eye opener was, one, how drunk were our grandparents and parents. It's like, geez, man. And 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 not being tied to a phone all the time or a computer. I'm like, oh, that's kind of liberating. So those
Yeah.
things, I liked about it. The chauvinism, and the plight of, like, the women in the office, or the minorities, or even the art director who was gay, seeing those things and how we've changed or haven't changed. um, that was interesting for me to too, for me also. And just having it wrapped up in an industry that I love was
Yeah.
fun. um, but it's one of those things, like, if I did a series, it would be dark like that. It wouldn't be the happy advertising film or series that um, someone might wish that I made, instead of the dark one, that because that's just where I go. And so, like, but I thought it was great because they developed these characters so deeply, right? It's like, even John Hamm's main character, it's like, oh, he had this rich backstory. Even um, some of the minor characters from the first season ended up having these amazing backstories. And for me, that, as a writer, I totally love seeing that kind of thing, because there's nothing worse for me than to watch something or read something and walk away from it and totally forget it, right? It's like, oh, it was great while I was watching it, or great while I was reading it, but now I can't remember exactly what happened. And so I'm always trying to learn from stories that do it well, so that because that's what I hope is that people take away something from my books and it stays with them, whether they want it to or not.
Yeah, like if every time they go to a restaurant now they say, "Can I get a doggy style bag?" You know,
I like that you've read that.
yeah, it's going to stick with them. But the the Mad Men thing about that generation, I wonder if there was so much. Maybe it's just fun for the show to have them drinking all the time, but I wonder if that's how you deal with what the greatest generation dealt with. You know, you have the war and you're coming back and
Yeah,
you're trying to do whatever. That we're not going to talk about woe is me. We're just going to have a drink and then go out and do whatever. You know, it's toasted.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a great take on that. It's like we didn't talk about our feelings back then, right?
Yeah,
Going
you
to a
stuff them.
therapist is not a thing, right? You
Yeah,
dealt with it. You're like, I'm, I'm
stuff those feelings into a bag, pour alcohol on it,
yeah,
and then maybe in 20 or 30 years you'll be back far enough to where you can go, oh, this is the greater meaning of it, or you've forgotten it.
yeah.
Those
And
are your
either
ways
way,
to,
you're in a better place.
yeah. Plus you got a good TV show.
Yeah, there you go.
The developing the characters, I think, is one of the big things with writing, obviously, what you were talking about earlier, where you have to have that connection with them so the reader cares. And I remember writing some things in my mom, who is a creative writing teacher and does other stuff like that, where she said, I don't really like your main characters. And I was like, exactly. That's good. That's what I was going for, was you don't need to like them. They're just regular folk. I mean,
Yes.
most of the people, just from living lives, I think most people understand that a lot of the world you don't want to know. You can have the rose colored glasses of life's great and people are great, but and that can be true, but also people are basically bad. So let's go with that and write about regular people instead of the stylized version of how everybody's perfect. These are
Yeah.
all my opinions though. But
No,
so
I agree with you. And I've had people say, and even people I know and love and respect, say, I don't know who to root for in your book. I don't know who's the bad guy in your book. Or,
mm,
it was hard for me to like your main character. I'm like, it's the same as you. I'm like, good, because nobody is perfect, and not everybody is that, white knight. Oh, when he walks in the door, everyone knows that's the hero, and heroes have flaws and darkness to them, and the villains are not 100%, at least in my view. No bad person is 100% bad, right? They had a parent, they had a life that wasn't like, as a toddler they weren't scheming to kill people or take over the world, right? They had dreams. They feel like they're the hero in their story. uh, so I try to I that's what I not not for the reader, but for me. I try to get into their head, like, okay, from this point of view, from this awful person's point of view, what
mm,
would they do next? Not because they're awful, but because this is their view of the world and how the world is, and so that's how they'll react. And it's fun and it's dark and it's interesting, but yeah, I get people who are like, "Who's the good guy? Who should I like?"
yeah, finish the book and then tell me what what's your main, if you have it or if you've identified it, what do you think your main theme in writing is? Like, what are you trying to figure out as a writer, whether it's in just one book or going through all your books? It's always a theme there. What's the main thing in your mind? Because I understand the story is so much more expansive than anybody ever reads in a book, especially if you develop characters like you do and you have the notes on everything. There's people could talk to you about a book and you could explain things to them that aren't in the book but make complete sense because you've already thought it out. The story to you is huge.
Yeah.
So what's your main thing as a writer you think you're wrestling with or trying to figure out?
I love this question because that's another thing that when I sit down and I'm developing the story, I actually have a note like what's the theme of this story? Like what's the overarching not moral of the story because I think that makes it, too much of a fairy tale, at least for me. Like, what is the theme? And you're right. When I develop the characters, I even look at like, how do I want them to change from when we first meet them to the end? And so I try to have that kind of theme for each book. But I love your question because I don't know that I've consciously thought about that. But thinking about the two books that I've published and the one I'm working on now, for me, I think I really get into and like to explore like how we how we are as humans and people and how we interact and what makes us do the things that we do. In a Killer Secret, it was one of the characters is driven by love, one is driven by greed, one is driven by things that happened in their childhood, and like those are all things that we all deal with. Like, and so how does having a bad childhood make one person bad but another person not, right? And I like to think about that. In Fall of Faith, it really was kind of and I almost hesitate saying this because it's not a religious book or a book necessarily about religion, but there aren't. I mean, I can't say there aren't undertones of that, and I think that's me kind of working through what does faith mean to me,
Hmm.
and not just like religious faith, but faith in myself or faith in people I know or faith in humanity in general, right? Like, what does that mean, and how does that affect uh, people in our lives? And so I think it's that human condition that really is interesting to me because, I mean, we're crazy interesting animals, right? Like we do some unpredictable stuff to ourselves, to each other. Like you would think that, um, like even I'd say this all the time, like the society that we created for ourselves, where we have to work 5 days a week, 40 hours a week, uh, and money is all important. We created that.
Hmm.
Like we're supposedly at the top of the food chain, right? And this is the world that we wanted to create for ourselves, where it's like
Hmm.
we have to go out there and spend less time with our families to earn more money and to be more respected and for people to think that we're a good member of society. So I think about that all the time. It's like, oh man, like there's some things that we do ourselves that I'm like, why would we do that? Which is a very long-winded answer, I
No,
know.
it's good. It's a big question. So the idea of faith, then, I wonder if that distill it down a little more has to do with trust as well. Like, how do
Oh,
you know you can trust someone?
yeah.
Like, how
And
do you
even
know
trust
you can
yourself,
even,
right?
yes, how do you know you can trust yourself? These are things that if I was your mother in law and you just started dating my daughter, I'd be concerned about. But I think you have a good track record going. So, 7 kids in, I think we'll be okay with that now.
I hope so.
If I
I
was your
hope so.
mother-in-law, I probably still wouldn't read it all. But
And that's okay. That's another
yeah,
thing that I've realized, not everyone's my reader. It's like it's same, and I think that advertising has helped that also, right? It's like I have an audience. This is my
mm,
audience. Everyone else, I don't care what they think about. And if you like dark, disturbing psychological thrillers, there's a better possibility that you'll like my books. But if you don't, I don't even want you to pick it up uh,
yeah.
because you're
This
just
isn't
not.
the room for you. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's okay.
What how if you had to pick a person that was maybe not a famous person, but a person that people would know what they look like, what do you think Gladys from the truck stop looks like?
Oh, that is a great question. Um, okay, so this will tell you too much about me. Um, my characters are amalgams of people that I know, or people that, even famous people, like, I just put together pieces and create them. But in my head, it definitely helps me to have a picture. So my grandmothers are prominent in the Fall of Faith. The
Mm,
Miss Chicky, who's another main character, was modeled after my maternal grandmother, and I think Gladys was after my paternal grandma. Just a bigger gal, always the life of the party, even when she was older. Like, so we called her Granny.
mm,
Um, and she would come to visit us, and she always wore a muumuu,
mhm.
and she would open her trunk, and she would pull out these big, not bottles of wine, but like jugs of wine, and she would bring that in for her visit, and she would dance to Huey Lewis and the News. This was clearly the
Got to.
80s.
Yeah.
Uh, in the middle of the living room, and just was a great lady. And so that's where it started with.
Okay.
um, and then it just goes from there.
She got
But
a little more
but more,
coquettish as the story went
who did,
along there.
who did you picture?
Here you go. I got 2 ideas for you. And it's going to be one of those things where, as a writer, you look at it and you go, that's not what she looks like at all. But if I was casting the movie, like if
Yeah,
it
which is
was,
always a fun exercise.
yeah, if it was going to be a feature in the theater, on a streaming service, or a Lifetime movie, I'm not sure if it could make the Lifetime movie. But if you're going to do any of those, I have 2 ideas for who should play Gladys. One is Dan Aykroyd,
That is,
but you make him up a little, so he
yeah.
passes as a lady. You don't have to do much because he's an
Well, I
attractive
mean, he
man.
did
But
Julia Child, right? Like, on Saturday Night Live. So I think,
yeah. So he can do it. He can do it, and I think that would do well. You look back at Nothing But Trouble when he's playing the judge and such, and you go, okay, he's going to be okay in the makeup, and I think he's going to get the accent right. And
yeah,
I would just let him do it. I would say, here's the script, read it. This is the part I'd like you to do.
riff on it.
Let's
Yeah.
not talk about it. You just show me what you think. Let the actor act. The other one, I'd go a different direction because you could do a little bit of makeup and it's not going to be like I think it is in the book, but I'd go with Gina Gershom
Ooh. Okay. Yeah.
because you got that sex appeal going on in there, and she seems like a classy lady to me. And I think even if you like put her in some makeup to make her look older or make her look less attractive, I mean, it's going to be difficult to drag down, a star
Yeah.
like that. But I think you could also go with just smoking hot. Just go smoking hot with Gladys, and then there you go. I mean, it's to me, Gladys is kind of, and I haven't finished the book yet, but to me, she's a personification of a demon. And I'm not saying that about Gina or Dan, but I'm thinking that for the movie wise, this is
Yeah.
the visual I'm going with when I'm reading and also when I'm visualizing that action in my head. But
Yeah. She's kind of that guardian of Eton, kind of draws you in. Yeah.
yeah,
It's,
like Elizabeth Hurley was in the movie where she played the devil,
oh, yes.
Bedazzled. Is
Yes.
it Bedazzled?
That sounds right.
Definitely a B word.
Yeah.
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 But with Brendan Fraser. Yeah.
I mean, and you're talking about like casting the movie. I had the same kind of concerns when I turned the book over to the narrator, and I didn't give him a whole lot of notes. And I said, "There's lots of characters in this. Um, I just want to see what you do." And I feel like he nailed every single one of them. Like he
Mm.
just did such a crazy, amazing
Well,
job.
he's a professional, right? He's a professional for a reason.
Well, yes.
Yeah. Nice. I haven't listened to the audio version of that, but I'll have to check that out then. How are your audio sales? Do you find those that it
Yeah,
sparked more interest or what?
it definitely has. It's interesting. You know, I knew that. I mean, if like I said, I try to study the industry because I feel like this is a business, and you know, obviously for the last 5 years or so, right? It's been audio's where the future is. Audio's the one that's growing. You know, ebooks are slipping. And before audio, just to back up a little bit, it's interesting. I think I've sold just as many paperbacks as I've sold ebooks, which super surprising to me anyway, because I'm like, oh, I thought print was dead, but it's not. People love that solid copy that they can, you know, have in their hand and the smell of paper, you know.
Yeah,
Uh,
especially for that size of book too. Like an
yeah,
ebook with a big book is tough because it's thousands of pages. But
absolutely. Yeah. And then audio, I knew that there was an audience there. My wife prefers audiobooks. Um, and so I knew that there were people who they probably only read with audio. And so the two books have only been out since I want to say less than a month. And I've already sold 35, 37 copies uh,
wow.
between the two of them. So it's been surprising to me. I'm like, oh
Yeah,
man,
that sounds good.
I haven't sold 30 copies of a book in a month since, you know, launch.
Since you bought 30 copies of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Since I wanted to see, I wanted to juice my numbers. But, you know,
Yeah.
since launch month, you know, I'll sell 2 or 3 a month consistently. And I'm happy with that. It's like, this is not my career. I guess if it was my career, I'd be super sad. But, you know, it's like, I still feel like I'm building and finding that audience. But to see that, oh man, you can sell that many audiobooks in a month. And again, it's the first month it's out, so maybe that's you know, maybe that'll go down. But it just seems like, yeah, that's a market that you need to tap into.
Hmm. I listened to an audiobook or tried to back in 1987 and it didn't work out well for me. So maybe I need to get back into it. None of
I
my
can't
stuff's
do it.
on
I mean,
audio.
I wish I could. My mind wanders, and I think hopefully that's what makes me a good writer, because my mind is always thinking about things and connecting things that aren't connected. But trying to listen to an audiobook, it's impossible. I'll be like, oh man, I zoned out there. I was thinking of something. So now I got to go back and start listening.
Yeah.
And I'm really going to listen. And then my mind wanders again. I'm like, I can't do
Yeah. And then people that listen to it while they're driving, it's like, man, you're occupying a lot of that dolphin brain in there, listening to that while you're also going down the interstate at 80 miles an hour.
it. Right.
Yeah. Mm. Well, what's next then for your writing? You're working on a book now.
I am
How
working on a
many
book.
books fresh out?
Working on a book. Um, it's called Words Fail Me. At least that's what it's called right now. And I'm going to tell you, I'm working on this book, and then, you know, the next book I publish may be something else.
Yeah.
But it's outlined. It's ready to go. It's the first story I wanted to tell, and I'm not really sure how to classify it yet. You know, I gravitate towards thrillers. This is more of a coming of age. There is mystery to it, um, but it'll be interesting. And then to get out of my comfort zone, I'm also writing with another writer friend of mine, and he is a pantser. He does not outline, and he's like, let's
Oh,
just do a Google Doc, and I'll write a chapter and you write a chapter. And I'm like, that sounds awful. So
yeah.
let's do it. So we're
Okay.
on chapter 4 or 5 now, and it's super fun, but it's super uncomfortable. But I think
Mm.
that's, as an artist, as someone who, you know, lives for creativeness, I always want to push myself. So I'm hoping that that will end up being a good story and we'll publish that. Um, if not, it's a good brain exercise.
Yeah, it's interesting the turns a story takes when you have somebody else writing it with you.
Oh
Um,
yeah, yeah,
it's as long as you're not so caught up in what you want to happen, and you can just go, okay,
Yeah. And
then
we're at the
let's just
point
see.
where we haven't even talked about a story. We're like, because I'm thinking, okay, a sane writing team would say, okay, here's our story, right? Here's our we're gonna start here and we'll end here, and then if we're gonna do this not outlining thing, which is weird to me, we won't
Yeah.
talk about the middle, but we'll know where we're going. We didn't even talk about what the story's gonna be. He's just like, no, you just write the first chapter and we'll go from there. So I'm scared to death it'll be awful, or that it'll be really good and I'll have to keep writing that way.
Well, in my experience with it, you end up trying to make the other person laugh.
Yeah,
Is
well, that's
how
that's kinda yeah. I
you
not
put things in
necessarily
there.
fast because that's not my writing style, but I'm like, "Ooh, I want this to be interesting to him." I want him to say like, "Oh god, where do I go with that?" So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, it's obstacles for them to figure out, and you're also trying to make them laugh when they're reading it.
yeah.
That was the fun part about collaboration, I think. And I don't think there was any I haven't had a negative experience with it. I've written 2 books with another guy, and they're pretty good. They didn't turn out how I thought the story was gonna go, and we did talk about it a little. So we had basic ideas, but a lot of the ideas were kind of he said, "This is the story I'm thinking about," and I felt like I was a guest in the story of, "Okay, well, I'll do this, I'll do this." So I deferred to him on a lot of things, but he also let me do things in it that, I wasn't held back much. There was a few times where he's like, "I don't think that happened. I think this happened." And then we'd write both versions and then see which one we like best.
Ooh, that's an interesting
That's
idea, yeah.
It'd be a good way to write a choose your own adventure
Oh, absolutely.
because
Yeah,
you could just say, well, this is obviously a point where we diverge. So I want to see where this goes, but I also think it needs to go this way. So let's do that. That would be interesting.
yeah. There's so many ways to get a story out and, into people's brains that it's amazing to me. There is no one right way. And I think that's great as new writers come in. There's no one way to write a novel. There's, obviously it'd be awesome if there was, and you can master that and you know that you're going to have bestsellers each time. But I think for me, the process of writing is what makes it so fun. Obviously, I want to have that feedback and see that people are enjoying the story. But even if nobody bought my books, I'm like, it's an interesting way for me to spend my time. And it's almost like, oh, sales are a nice to have. Now, my cats are fighting. I hope that came off in the audio. I hope that was super loud for you.
Yeah, it was
Uh,
good. It was terrifying. Gladys. Okay.
I need to write that into the next book.
Yeah.
But it's like, this is a great hobby for me. And that's how I kind of treat it right now. It's like I want it to be a long-term career, but for now I'm kind of happy spending my time in these dark places and these dark stories, and it I think it, one keeps me out of trouble because I'm not doing something else. Now it doesn't keep my characters out of trouble, but it also, it gives me a way to express myself and have fun. And yeah, if people read it, that's amazing to me. It's still amazing to me that, people that I don't know read my books. Like
Yeah.
I hope that sensation never goes away. Because it's a cool thing. Not everybody can say that. Not very many people can.
Yeah. It's good. It's good stuff. So you have that book you're working on, you have your thing you're working on with another writer, a collaboration. The audiobooks, I guess, are out there and you're going to see how they go.
Yes.
I don't want to take up all your time. I've definitely enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah.
We got your website, jeffberney.com,
Correct.
and I'll put that in the show notes along with your Pinterest because I feel like people need to see that part of Kansas City.
Well,
And
I feel like I need to go do some posts there just to make sure
yeah,
it wasn't a 2 year old.
I'm just saying, put it on your schedule. One a month to do.
I could do
Man, I'm just here. Every morning I wake up, I'm like, I'm gonna check his Pinterest, see what's up. Nothing. Nothing. So I worry, I worry.
yeah,
But
something could have happened to me.
yeah. So any thoughts or anything you have for closing that we didn't talk about?
I don't have any words of wisdom. I've enjoyed this conversation. I love talking about writing, um, whether it's mine or somebody else's. I think it's just such a um, cool part of being human too, right? It's like we learn from stories. We share our lives through stories, and being able to be a part of that and do that for a living. And I think that's why I gravitated towards advertising. Also, is like
Yeah.
it's a great way to make a living. I mean, if you have to live in a society that we created ourselves where we have to make money to survive, then why not do something that you enjoy?
Yeah. That's I mean, you are writing for a living, so you're
Yeah.
doing this and that. It's good stuff. The Maybe if we talk again, perhaps we can get into the idea of the underlying issue of why it's cool that other people read a thing you wrote, and does that mean that the creativity or this imagination, the reason it resonates with people is because it comes from some sort of shared space?
Oh yeah.
these are these are things to think about when you're
This is
doing your
another
yoga.
hour-long conversation. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love
Yeah.
that.
All right, so we'll put that on the burner for next time.
Perfect.
I appreciate your time today. And as I said, everybody should check out the website. You got some merch on there. So, pick up a mug. I appreciate you being on
Thank you
today.
so
And
much for having me. Yeah.
I'll talk to you on the other side of this exit music.
All right.
All right.